me. So just want to be upfront and let you know that there's been a slight change in who's presenting. Jennifer Brown, who is my co-presenter, actually will not be able to join us this morning. So I am going solo. So I will do my best to cover everything that she was going to say as well. So just so you know a little bit about my background, I'm the director of the Westchester Library System. I also have a PhD in human development. So one of my areas is really looking at how people and systems work together, which is one of my interests in this topic. But I'll say Jennifer was really the driving agent for this presentation, largely through her real life experiences as a new director at the Field Library in Peekskill, New York. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to really think about how our individual work styles influence how we as leaders, but also how we as followers react to change. We wanted to look at some of the typical responses to change, and then think about a model. And in our case, we chose the Bridges transition model to help frame conversations about change so that we could really help people develop strategies to work through that change. So our hope is that as you sort of listen to the things that we'll be discussing today, it gives you some different ideas, some different actions that you would feel comfortable taking back to your life, back to your work environment, and sort of implementing to see if they can help create some of the positive influences that you're hoping to accomplish. And because we're all about lifelong learning, I would love for you to just take a chance to think for a moment about how comfortable you are leading through others through change. Are you highly uncomfortable? Are you very comfortable? And what are the aspects about leading through change that make you feel less comfortable? Just want you to sort of hold on to that. And as we go through the presentation, at the end, I'll ask you this question again, partly because I want to see, have we managed to answer some of your questions? And if not, then certainly let's bring them forward at the Q&A at the end so that we can try to address them directly. So the big question, turbulent times, what causes turbulence? And I think in 2020, we pretty much can say just about everything creates turbulence. COVID-19 has clearly impacted people at so many levels. Politics, just turn on the TV today, is creating turmoil. In general, we've tended to talk about it more in terms of technology, but even things like climate change, how it has impacted our ability to operate our libraries, based on extreme weather. Fluctuations with the economy, we have a budget, we don't have a budget. And I think more and more family, not that family's bad, but just that family in the sense of elder care. More and more folks are having to address elder care. Child care is very expensive in this country. Trying to balance sort of all of those elements adds stress. Work in and of itself is different. And I would say COVID-19 has really highlighted what does it mean to work in a hybrid environment, something that we had all thought about once upon a time, but now are truly experiencing. And the other thing too is to think about even like a new boss or a new board president. It doesn't have to be an organizational large issue. It can just be one change of a staff person can create a whole new turbulence within your environment. So before we get too far down the road here, though, I do want to just touch base again on a couple of the core concepts. So first, leadership. A lot of definitions around leadership, and almost all of them are from an organizational perspective. But this definition, influencing people to complete work that moves the organization forward towards its goals. Pretty simple. in a library perspective, our goals are generally defined by our strategic plan or by our long-range plan. And these are heavily influenced by the mission, vision, and values of your organization. And as I've mentioned, most of the literature really does look at leadership from sort of a management for-profit perspective. Not that that's bad, but I just think as a nonprofit, we need to understand that a lot of times the theories that we're discussing were designed for a different economic engine. But I think the core concepts around there being leaders, followers, and the organizational culture as three frameworks that are sort of coexisting is important. It's very difficult to lead your followers if you don't have a shared sense of what the organizational culture should be going forward. And quite honestly, the organizational culture can make it more difficult for you as a leader to encourage the followers to have change. So all of these elements are correlated and overlap. But quite honestly, I think in many ways, the most important part of this whole equation is the human factor. We all play a dual role. We're both the self and we're the other. We are the one who's the leader, but at other times we're also the follower. And I think as a leader or someone who is in a leadership role, you really have to understand where you are first. So you need to increase your self-awareness about how you're responding to the change, to these turbulent times, before you can begin to help others navigate their own pathway. So that whole saying about know yourself first is really applicable as we think about today's discussion. And, quite honestly, let's be honest, change is uncomfortable. That's its nature. Change is sort of the impetus that creates things that we had not had before. Sometimes that's great. Sometimes it's not so great. And part of the challenge that we have as leaders is helping individuals think about something that doesn't feel great today and kind of helping them morph it into something that they're comfortable with for tomorrow. It's a challenge, and that's why we're here, right? When we talk about change, I think the most important thing to remember is that change happens to someone, even if you don't agree with it. You really don't have a choice. Change just pushes itself into your pathway. And, when we think about change, there's good changes, like you bought a scratch off and you won, and now you have more money than you had before. That's a positive change. Unlikely, but a positive change. And then there's the bad changes. And I say bad, in parentheses. This is something where, let's say that you just finished a major construction project in your library, a pipe burst, and now that area you just finished is damaged again. That's a change that initially feels terrible, but then as you sort of think about it going forward, you realize, well, actually there were a few things about that renovation that weren't perfect. Here's our chance to address it again. So part of what we're looking at are the perceptions around the change. What is a person's actual role in that change? What's the degree of control you have in that change? Even our own personalities. Some of us are more willing to go with the flow. Some of us really prefer the structure. Our comfort level with either of those approaches will impact how we initially feel about the change. It doesn't define how we will respond to the change down the road, but it does impact our ability to sort of be more accepting initially to that change. And quite honestly, just our whole stress level at that moment of change is very important. If you're already highly stressed to begin with one more change could just be the straw that broke the camel's back. So there's all these different elements that we need to take into consideration. Now, transition, this is what happens in our minds as we go through the change. And quite honestly, this is what we're really going to be talking about today, is how do we help with that journey of transition? How do we help individuals? How do we help the organization move through the different processes that take place once change has occurred? And to be honest, change is immediate. It's like, wow, that change just happened. Transition is a long-term journey. It goes much slower. And we'll be looking at a model that basically identifies it in 3 stages. And it's called the Bridges transition model. And basically, at the very beginning, phase 1, it's about loss. Phase 2, the neutral, is about the beginnings of acceptance. And then phase 3 really is about embracing that change. And we're going to walk our ways through each of these different phases. Now, I want to just call your attention to the two arrows, the one for importance and the one for time. These are 2 factors that really impact how people move through the different processes. The more important it is, the faster you will likely move through. The more time you have, that gives you a different pathway. It may take longer, but you'll likely have less resistance at the very end. So it's just different perspectives, some ways to sort of think about external factors that will be influencing the process as you go through it together. So phase or stage 1, ending, losing, and letting go. This is basically the, oh my God, I can't believe this just happened to me. You know, that whole sort of moment. And once again, remember, change happens to people. People rarely initiate the change themselves. It's nice when it happens that way, or if you're the person who initiated the change, it will be easier for you. But most of us experience the change that has been forced on us. And what does that trigger? Fear, denial, sadness, disorientation, frustration, sense of loss. If we think about COVID-19, I think back to March, most of us probably were well within most of these 6 elements. We didn't know what the heck was going on with COVID-19. It was a terrifying time. It was very confusing. There were different instructions. You know, your library's open, your library's closed. You know, don't touch this. You know, all these different elements. And basically, what happened is we lost the structure that we knew, and we had to, you know, sort of embrace something different. So one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that these are highly emotional responses, and emotions trigger other elements. They trigger stress. They trigger, you know, the fight or flight, different elements within. So as a leader, you know, one of the things we want to do is really to be much more empathetic about the impact that this is having on others. So a couple things just to sort of take a break here and remember. Change and transition, they don't always work in a smooth arrangement. So resistance is not futile. Let's be honest. Staff or others can actually stop the transition in its tracks. So as a leader, we really need to think through the long-term objectives of where do we want to take our organization, and then start to think about the short-term goals that will start to get us moving down that long-term pathway. one of the things we want to make sure is that we give the followers or our staff members enough time to process throughout the different stages or phases. There's a lot to absorb, and it's oftentimes more time effective to create a pause in the process so people can catch their breath than it is to just keep pushing consistently through. I would highly advocate for pause moments and really use those with active listening. And by active listening, I'm really thinking about one-on-one or other types of small group conversations where you just listen. You're actually trying not to interrupt. You're trying to ask open-ended questions or clarifying questions to understand how do people feel at the moment. It doesn't mean that you can fix everything at the moment, but really what you're trying to do is get prepared to answer the what's in it for me question. Every staff person who is going through a change really wants to understand, how does this change directly impact them and the organization? But we're human. Oftentimes we think about ourselves first, and sort of how do I fit into this picture of where the organization's going. So you want to be able to sort of hear that individual concern and then think about how to address it in the what's in it for me question as part of the what's in it for the organization question. The other thing is to make sure that you have support mechanisms in place for everybody, yourself included. And oftentimes we have resources available that we don't think about. Many of our health insurance plans include an employee assistance program. There are coaches, there are mental health experts who can help us deal with some of the personal issues that we're facing. The other thing would be training. There may be a need to be very clear about specific trainings that we need staff to have under their belt as part of this process. An example, would be if you're switching to a new ILS, do you have, the types of training that all different levels of staff would need so that on day one, they can function. The other part is understanding. As a leader or someone who is leading the change, your understanding about why this change is important may be different than the understanding of those who are following you. So you really want to make sure that you're all, in the same book, on the same chapter, hopefully on the same page going forward. And decreasing fear of change, fear of what we're losing. Those are very real elements, and it makes it difficult for anyone to sort of move into the next phases if you're still sort of grappling on to the past, because many of us identify ourselves by the tasks that we do at work. And if those tasks are changing, who are we? It's a real question. It's a deep philosophical issue. And work is hard enough without having to drag in that philosophical who am I question along the way. So the more that you can sort of get back to that what's in it for me and who am I element as a leader with your staff, it takes time, yes, but I think it's time well spent, and I think it's time that will build a stronger foundation for going forward. So we've been talking about the ending, losing, letting go. Now we'll get into the much more exciting, the neutral zone. So this is really the bridge. This is the bridge between what was and what will be. And the challenge here is that, oops, went too far, is that this is what I would sort of call the teenage zone. This is where we have a lot of emotional conflict because we aren't really sure who we are as an individual, who we are as an organization. You know, it's kind of like going through high school again. You're trying to figure out, you know, which group do I belong to, and you know, is that the right group? So here we have a lot of resentment, a lot of skepticism towards the change. We tend to have low morale, low productivity, a lot of anxiety about our roles, and we are starting to see hints of creativity and innovation and renewal. So a lot of the leadership that we're trying to do in this phase is helping others to find a window that makes it a little bit clearer for them about who they are in this new world that's emerging. What is their purpose? You know, what's their new identity in this world that's being created? And I think one of the challenges oftentimes as a leader is that we feel like, oh, wow, we kind of got out of that, you know, why me phase, and we're sort of into this new phase. So things are looking great. Well, they are, except for the fact that staff are pretty much emotionally and physically exhausted at this point. Everything that you're trying to do is twice as hard as it used to be. Think about with COVID when it came on. So we all flipped over to the hybrid environment. It sounds easy, but if you're like me, and we're still learning, everything is taking me much longer than it should, or what I anticipate that it will take. It seems harder than it should be. And you know, I'm like 90% there, but there's still that other 10% I can't quite figure out how to do. There's that constant sense of uncertainty, of almost there, but not quite there. Things just aren't as smooth as they used to be. So as a leader, we need to build in, you know, a cushion and be realistic about how much can people actually accomplish as we're transitioning into this new environment. So here's some steps that you can think of as a leader to really help yourself and your staff through this process. Open door policy. This gets back to that active listening that we talked about in phase or stage 1, but really do have an open door policy. Don't just say it, actually do it. And part of that is having an open door where you actually focus on the individual who is connecting with you. So turn off your phone, lower your phone, you know, get away from the emails, focus on the person that's in front of you, and it help them with that one issue that they want to talk about at this time. This really allows for frequent one-on-one discussions, but also think about stepping up the number of staff meetings that you have. You know, it may be, even if it's 15 minutes once a week, but just an opportunity to have a touch base with people. And, you know, something to think about as well is perhaps follow up the staff meetings with an email communication that just says, here are the bullet points that were discussed today. You know, if you have any questions, you know, feel free to follow up with me. Keep that open door policy as structured and as consistent as possible. Remembering the short-term goals and the long-term goals. It's part of it is trying to maintain perspective through this whole process. You know, the short-term goals are great because there's some easy wins, but we always need to be reminded of where we're going down the road, because you know, this is a journey. It's not going to just stop at one point in time. It's going to continue. So we need to keep reminding people that these short-term goals are leading towards this bigger long-term goal, which is really related to the mission, vision, and values, and you know, the long-range plan of the library. Encourage people to actually talk about their feelings. You know, it's kind of interesting because in the United States, I think we've always been taught in the work environment, don't talk about your feelings. It's a sign of weakness, you know, these other elements. But I would sort of say, you know, we spend so much time at work. We have all these relationships with our coworkers. Our emotions are part of us. Our reactions are part of us. If we're feeling stressed, if we're feeling angry, if we're feeling frustrated, we need to find constructive outlets for how to address that. And as a leader, as a manager, I see part of my job is fostering an environment with people when they're frustrated, hopefully early in the process, catch the issue early in the process while it's still a small issue. Can we think about strategies to mitigate the cause, or perhaps to establish different approaches for how that person could interact either with another person or with the task at hand? And celebrating and acknowledging, the short-term goals and accomplishments. I will say some people are much better at that than others. I am probably not very good at celebrating short-term goals. I have staff who remind me that it's important, and that, and that's great because that's what I need. I get so fixated on pushing, down through the number of checklist items, to get to the goal. We all need someone who sort of calls us on our own tendencies and helps us remember, what's important for everyone. We all have different things that make us feel like we're accomplishing something. And for many individuals, it is much more social. So are there ways that we could create celebratory moments, even virtually, where we just acknowledge that, the things that we've done well, and what we're going to try to do next? And quite honestly, managing workloads. This, I think, more than anything, is one of the hardest, because we've sort of been trained as library individuals to always do more with less. And the truth is, that's not sustainable. You have to figure out what's the right balance. It's generally, you can do less with less, but you can think about what your priorities are. And as a leader, our role is to really think about what are the key priorities that need to happen, and what are the other things that we could set aside now. And a lot of that is a conversation that happens with individuals to sometimes help them identify, are there activities that I would call a sacred cow, something that we just do because we've always done it? Is that something that we could stop doing? Are there activities that one person could delegate to another, and it frees up the one person, but it gives the other person some new opportunities to learn and grow? So there are ways, but as a leader, I think it's really important that you look at the stress level that is happening because of the change, and figure out when is it in your control to remove some elements of that stress from the individual or from the department. The one thing I will say, though, is be very careful when you do so to make sure that you're responding in the same way for all employees. You don't want to basically have the perception that you're playing favorites with others. So you want to make sure that you're being consistent in the behaviors that you're having with all of your employees, so that whatever's true for one individual, one department, is part of that consideration for all the others. So the model, we've managed to go through the first two phases. I'm hoping that you're still awake. And now we're going to get to the good part, which is the new beginning. This is really, when we're starting to see hope. We're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And this is when the change becomes a little bit less of a burden and a little bit more about something that's positive. And during this phase, people are starting to actually feel much more comfortable about the new skills that they've learned. And in some ways, they start to forget about some of the things that they had done in the past. So you have much higher energy. There's certainly more openness to learning, and people are starting to, sort of redefine their roles, get much more comfortable with their roles, and sort of see the organization in a slightly different way. The challenge is, because there's always a challenge, that not everyone goes through the stages at the same speed. So it sounds very linear. You do stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, but it's more of a sliding scale back and forth. So you will have some employees who are in stage 3, you'll have some who are in stage 2, and you'll have some who are probably in stage 1. And based on other factors in our lives, we may ourselves slip from stage 3 down to stage 2. It's hard. There's not just, a clear pathway for any of this. But I don't want you to have, to feel hopeless. All of these stages are important because they really help us embrace the change. It's just that, we embrace it at different ways, at different times, and at different speeds. But hopefully there's enough commonality, enough belief in the mission, vision, and values, in that organizational culture, that it helps you all move together, just perhaps not as a really small ball, but perhaps as sort of a larger herd of cats. You're all moving forward in the same direction. So in stage 3, the new beginning, as a leader, you want to make sure that you have linked the employees' work goals, their day-to-day activities, to the longer-term objectives of the organization. You want to have that consistency in your messaging, through the job descriptions, through the evaluation process, through the stories that you're telling to the community. And as you think about the ways that you're highlighting your successes, through the stories that you tell, are you anchoring them in the mission, vision, and values of your organization? Once again, take time to celebrate. But remember, not everyone is in stage 3. So also celebrate the victories that happen for individuals who are still in stage 1 or stage 2. And you cannot be complacent. This is an ongoing process. So one of the things I recommend is that you think about the support network that you have for you as a leader, as an individual. Do you have people who will sort of give you the strength that you need through this journey? So I will say at WLS, I feel that the administrative staff that I work with are my backbone. They're the ones who call me on my moments of uncertainty. They're the ones who provide me with a little extra, you can do this, don't give up. But also I think about my friends. I have friends who are in different organizations or different businesses. And sometimes it's helpful just to get a different perspective outside of the library world. We are a different breed. Doesn't mean that we don't have similarities to other groups, but sometimes it's helpful to hear someone else's perspective on what you're experiencing in the work environment, to just give you a different way to reflect on what you're experiencing. So, well, the other thing I want to say is many of us in the library profession are introverts, and I will, declare myself as an introvert. We have a tendency to hold on to issues internally because we want to process them internally first, before we take the action of expressing something with others. That can be a strength, but in times of change, that can also be a detriment because it can create additional stress internally. And once again, when you're stressed, it's sort of a negative process that just feeds itself. So if you're an introvert, I encourage you to find some extroverted activities just to release some of that stress that you may be experiencing so that you can be more open to helping others deal with their stress along the journey. Because as a leader, part of our job is to make sure that everyone else has the tools that they need so that they can go down that journey. So just a quick reminder. Change is what happens to people. Transition is what happens inside of one's mind when presented with the change. So transition is what we're really looking at when we think about dealing with the turbulent times. So you need to take care of yourself, so then you can take care of others. And then together, hopefully, you will be able to really think about these new times as an adventure, as a journey that you're taking together to create a better library, a better world for your community. So I'm hoping that this was helpful. If you think about sort of where your comfort level was initially, and you just think about some of the action items, some of the discussion that we had, sort of where do you still fall in the scale? And then what are the areas that you still don't feel comfortable about? And that's what I'd love for you to bring into the Q&A. What are the areas that seem most problematic from your perspective? Let's talk about them a little bit. So Jeremy, are there any questions?
All right, thank you. And thank you for the presentation. There's been some good conversations happening in the chat. A lot of just a conversation and comments so far. So I will certainly encourage folks to, if they have questions, to drop them in and we'll address those. But I will maybe just catch you up a little bit. People were very much on board for routine staff check-ins and the idea of those weekly staff meetings. And I added to the chat that we've been doing that, and how sometimes even in the beginning, but then even ongoing, it can feel like a little bit of overkill. Like, oh gosh, we're doing another staff, really? Like, is this really the best use of everyone's time? But even the non-hard business stuff that's happening really gives people an opportunity. We're just touching in and knowing how we're doing, and gives us an opportunity for a little more connection, because as everybody knows, we're all so separated right now. And then there was a comment in there about Alyssa Valente from the William K. Sanford Library here in the Albany area. Their library has created an accomplishments and testimonials Google Doc where everyone puts in, some of those kudos stories that all the staff can see, because lots of times I'm sure, one person hears it, but not everybody else does. So I wanted to and people plus wanting that in a number of ways. Number of kudos for you in the chat for a fantastic presentation. So now we got some questions coming in. Tim Spindler from the Long Island Library Resources Council is asking, how do you handle things when a fast change is needed that is a major change?
Well, great question. Probably 9 times out of 10 poorly, because sometimes the change just happens. And then it's kind of trying to pick up the pieces afterwards. That's clearly not the ideal answer, and I know that. What one hopes is that every day that we're trying to build a culture of trust, a culture of adaptability, so that when those immediate changes that just happen, that we have enough trust in each other and in our ability to work as a team, that we can work through it together. It's, I often think of libraries as sort of like a big dysfunctional family where, for the most part, we all get along, but we definitely have different perspectives along the way. And I think, when those huge changes, sudden changes happen, the hard part is that there are oftentimes many different approaches that people want to take. And as a leader, you have to pick one. So how do you get enough people to follow you with that one change, and then start to address the concerns of those other groups that had a different thought on how to get there? And a lot of that is around ongoing conversations around the commonalities or similarities. Process is hard, but process is important.
And kind of shifting to maybe a different area. Sarah Taylor from the Niagara Library System asks, what's the best way to prevent oversharing of emotional burdens? Some things are for work and others not.
Yeah, and that is definitely going to be a very personal definition of what's considered oversharing. I think a lot of that could be addressed if there are one-on-one opportunities to have a conversation with the person, so that it's not necessarily a public sharing. What I would say is that in many cases, individuals have not necessarily had an opportunity to express themselves. So sometimes that first encounter can be a little bit more dramatic, perhaps, than one would feel comfortable. But sometimes once it's out of the system, then the future encounters would be what would fall more within the traditional business appropriate types of discussions. So I think part of it is having a safe space for the emotions just to be, and then sort of allowing a more coach-like environment where you sort of structure what feels like the appropriate types of ongoing discussions related to emotions and those frustrations going forward.
Jessica Bowen from the Nanette Public Library. Any further thoughts on leadership as an introvert?
Oh, yeah. Actually, as introverts, you have a lot of advantages. So here's part of it. As an introvert, you have the ability to be very thoughtful before you speak. Part of the challenge is that you can't spend too much time thinking. So one of the challenges is being prepared as you go into situations, especially when I was earlier in my managerial experiences. I often had a script that I would sort of have in front of me for how I wanted to direct the conversations that I was having, to make sure that I didn't leave things out. And I think it's also fair to let people know that a conversation that you have as an introvert, that these are some of my observations, that I would welcome hearing from you, either by phone or in person or by email. But my behavioral patterns is I will listen to you and I will probably respond tomorrow, just because I need time to process before I respond. So part of it is managing other people's expectations of what they should expect from you. So if you're not comfortable providing immediate responses to something that you hear, that's okay. I think just managing other people's expectations for when they should expect to hear from you about your decisions or your thoughts going forward.
Excellent advice. Anita from Ramapo Catskill asks, what are good ways to encourage those outside the office to share in conversations and recognitions, for example, boards of trustees?
Ooh, okay. I think I have to be careful. I might have a couple of my own board members here. So Working with the board as part of the change process can introduce some important but difficult elements. So the board is really responsible for the overall strategy and governance of the library, and the executive director is the person who implements that, using the staff resources and so forth. It can be hard sometimes for the board to recognize how difficult it is to actually move changes forward. Some things sound really simple when you just say it. Oh, we're going to, start a new ILS. Not a problem, One ILS is the same as the other. But as a library staff person, you realize there's all these different components that are impacted. So part of the challenge, I think, in working with the board is to help them think about the change in terms of the small milestones that you will be reporting back to the board, and helping them to understand how important it is that they publicly acknowledge these small accomplishments or small goals that have been met, and what it means in terms of the overall foundation for that long-term goal. To me, having a board that is truly supportive of the staff can be very invigorating. It can actually make a huge difference in the overall morale of the organization. So I really encourage boards to be very thoughtful about what they say in their public meetings, but also, to be that positive advocate for the direction that the library is moving in, not necessarily getting caught up in the smaller details.
That's a perfect segue into Christy Doherty's question from Buffalo and Erie. There's just kind of the other side of that, and advocating to the board. Any tips for justifying time for staff meeting, especially when there's an expectation to always be busy doing tangible things, in quotes?
Yes. So what I would say is that if you want to make sure that the tangible results that are accomplished are actually the tangible results that you are needing to be accomplished, that can only be done through communication. And I think having the board understand that the staff meetings aren't necessarily just a time waster, but rather they're a way to use time more effectively when staff are, back in their roles. And I think just reminding, the board that once again, here's a chance to make sure that everyone understands how their job fits into the bigger picture. And it creates a certain amount of teamwork. It creates a greater opportunity to have sustainability. I would encourage all of us to think about doing cross-training if we haven't done it already in terms of roles. If nothing, working in a virtual environment has really reminded us that that there are some things that if one person is the only person doing that job and that person's not there, then everything else falls apart. And I think through these staff meetings, you can start to identify what are your business moments of weakness. Where do you have that potential that if one person's out, everything else in the organization is going to be negatively affected. Staff meetings are part of business continuity. So I would sort of use that framework when I talk to the board.
So Tamise Gates from the Fayetteville Free Library has a question for you. Do you have any thoughts on the buzzwords emotional intelligence as it relates to leadership? And are you aware of any resources that you would like to point out related to that topic?
So yes, I mean, Daniel Coleman wrote a lot about emotional intelligence, and I think, yes, it's an important aspect. What I would say is emotional intelligence sometimes has been described almost as a fad. I don't necessarily believe that, but I think when I think about active listening, to me, a lot of that is related to emotional intelligence. A lot of it is trying to understand where you as a leader fit in terms of your own strengths and weaknesses, and where is the staff person that you're having the discussion with, and sort of how do the two places where you're each existing, how do they interact? I mean, to say it crudely, it's almost like, astrological signs. If you're a Libra at the moment, how are you responding to this person who's more of an Aries at the moment? And sort of figuring out some of those aspects. I would say our emotional intelligence can grow over time, but it can also change over time. So there's never a one and done in terms of emotional intelligence. It will be impacted really by all these other life factors that are happening. So as an example, I think, when I think about a lot of the work that I do at WLS is related to emotional intelligence. A lot of what I do is listen. And by listening, by trying to be empathetic, I start to see issues from multiple perspectives, not just from the way that I viewed it, but really how does this person view it? And I think that in and of itself is part of that broader emotional intelligence role. And then, one could think about it in terms of strengths and weaknesses. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects, but I think, there's a book out there called Leading with Your Strengths. There's a lot of different approaches, but I think honestly, being true to yourself, knowing who you are so that you can then help others along the journey, that to me is really what emotional intelligence is all about.
Thank you. So I'm going to give Peggy the last question that we have time for this morning, and that would be, and I'm sorry, I'm scrolling and it's moving away on me, so I'm trying to get back to the question. There it is. Do you recommend eliciting how people have dealt with change and transition in the interview process?
Actually, I think it's not a bad question. I think understanding a little bit about how individuals have adapted to change in the past can be helpful. I would just caution us not to be looking for this as the defining factor for hiring or not hiring somebody. When we think about diversity, inclusion, having different approaches to change, even when some of those approaches are more divergent, perhaps, from the approach that we as a leader would have, can be helpful. It can be maddening, but it can also be very helpful, because at the end, you will have probably a much stronger transition process in place, and greater buy-in with all, if you have a lot of different perspectives that are part of that process.
Excellent. Actually, I think we got maybe time for one more. Although I think we've clicked on most of them. I do want to give a shout out to really everyone who's been doing a fantastic job in the chat. There's been some great conversations happening back and forth, which I appreciate, since we're not together in person. So people sharing back and forth, and a lot of thank yous and thumbs up and kudos for you, Terry. So thank you for a phenomenal program. As we're moving up towards the top of the hour, a couple of housekeeping notes, just answering some questions in the chat as well. The session is being recorded. Take a little bit of time for us to do the post-production, get it mixed down and adding the closed captioning, but we'll be posting they'll be available on this page. You'll browse to the session and they'll be below the session is the link off to the archive. Some questions about, some people were asking about the CE credit pop-up that appears. Hopefully you're all familiar with that at this point. Though that pop-up appears based on your duration in the program. So you have to have been in the room for a certain amount of time before that pop-up will appear. So that's why some of you may have seen it and some of you haven't. I see Terry's got his contact information there on the screen. We very much appreciate that. And I'm sure Jennifer wouldn't mind hearing from you either on this. Really, really phenomenal stuff this morning. And my thanks to you, Terry, and to Jennifer for pulling this together, and to everyone in the chat for their fantastic questions. It really has been a great conversation to kick off our second day of the virtual conference. We have a couple of minutes, and I invite all of you that are online to join us. Next thing on the schedule is the NILA President's Forum, which is something that's hasn't happened before. It's a new thing because we don't have the inaugural banquet on Friday evening to give the presidents the opportunity to communicate with you all on their plans, both wrapping up this year and looking ahead. So join myself as well as Jennifer Cannell and Claudia Depkin for that coming up at 9:15. And again, remind you to please visit the exhibit hall and thank the exhibitors for making this possible. And lots of thanks for you, Dr. Kirchner. Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks everybody. We'll see you in the next room.
Take care, everyone.